Everyone in our neighborhood called Peter a killer after he saved my brother's life. When I proved his sister died from undiagnosed cardiac arrest, they blamed me for ruining everything. A year later, I watched kids play safely in her memorial garden because Peter taught them to swim. When I was 14, Peter became our next-door neighbor. The moving van was still being unpacked when my mother gripped my arm. "That's the boy whose sister died because of him," she whispered. He was supposed to be watching her. The way she spoke sent shivers down my spine. Within hours, the entire neighborhood knew the story. An 8-year-old girl gone, reportedly due to her older brother's carelessness. Parents murmured at their mailboxes, expressing pity for the family, lamenting the loss of a child because their son couldn't manage one simple task. My father was even more blunt, declaring, "That boy has blood on his hands. Stay away from him." I watched from my window as other parents literally pulled their children indoors the moment Peter appeared. He spent hours alone in his backyard, simply gazing at a small garden patch, completely cut off from everyone. Over the next few weeks, observing Peter was unsettling. Adults would deliberately cross the street to avoid passing him. When he walked to the corner store, parents would snatch their children's hands and rush them away, as if he carried a contagion. Grocery store staff trailed him down every aisle, hands on their radios, anticipating a theft. Yet, what truly struck me was this. Despite being treated like a pariah, Peter never ceased to be kind. He constructed shelters for stray cats in his garage, leaving food out nightly. When Mrs. Blake slipped on ice, Peter was the sole person who helped her up, while others merely watched. The child they labeled a killer was the only one demonstrating genuine human decency. Everything shifted the day my younger brother, Luis, fell through the ice at the neighborhood pond. We were playing hockey when we heard the snap, and Luis vanished beneath the surface instantly. The other children scattered, screaming, with no adults in sight. I stood paralyzed by fear. Then, Peter materialized from nowhere. Without a moment's hesitation, he plunged into the frigid water. I will never forget seeing him pull Luis out, his own lips turning blue. He performed CPR while I remained uselessly frozen. My brother coughed up water and began to breathe. Peter sat there, shivering and hypothermic, ensuring Luis was all right until the ambulance arrived. Then, he simply vanished. He didn't wait for thanks, nor did he seek recognition. At the hospital, my parents' initial words weren't about Luis's safety. Instead, they demanded, "Where were you? How did this happen?" When I informed them Peter had saved him, my mother's expression darkened. "He probably pushed Luis in first," she accused. "This is exactly what happened with his sister. He creates danger, then plays the hero." I was aghast at what I was hearing. My father was already on the phone. "We need to file a report," he insisted. "This dangerous child requires supervision." Within days, police were at Peter's house for a wellness check. Child services arrived next. The social worker's car in their driveway became a source of neighborhood entertainment. People stood on their lawns, watching, satisfied that something was finally being done. They even threatened to remove Peter from his parents' care because he had saved my brother. Then, the neighborhood truly lost control. Someone made an anonymous call, reporting Peter as a threat to local children. I witnessed Peter's mother collapse in their driveway, sobbing. His father attempted to board up windows while people snapped photos. They were actually contemplating sending Peter away, simply to shield him from our community. I found him behind the abandoned elementary school, knees drawn to his chest. She asked me to take her swimming that morning. He murmured, not looking up. I almost said no, to play video games instead. He explained he was teaching Olivia to kick in the shallow end when she suddenly went limp. He pulled her out immediately, performing CPR alone for 3 agonizing minutes before help arrived. I did everything correctly. He choked, perfect compressions, rescue breaths. Tears streamed down his face. But I kept thinking if someone better was there, she'd be alive. My parents look at me differently now. What if I'm a monster? I knew I had to act. The tremor in Peter's voice as he spoke of his parents' changed perception tightened my chest. I stood, brushing dirt from my jeans. Peter remained huddled against the wall, but I saw him watching me from the corner of his eye. I walked home, a plan forming in my mind. My parents were in the kitchen when I returned, huddled over coffee. They ceased talking the moment I entered. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, and my father drummed his fingers on the table. I went directly to my room and opened my laptop. Something about Peter's account didn't quite fit. An 8-year-old girl suddenly going limp in shallow water. Perfect CPR that failed. I began searching for information on sudden cardiac events in children, drowning statistics, anything that might clarify what truly happened to Olivia. The next morning, I slipped out early, before my parents awoke. Peter was already in his backyard, kneeling by that small garden patch. He didn't look up as I approached, but his shoulders stiffened. I sat beside him without a word. The garden was filled with purple flowers I didn't recognize. Peter's hands were caked with dirt as he meticulously pulled weeds from around each plant. He finally spoke after several minutes, his voice barely a whisper. He told me these were Olivia's favorite flowers. She had planted them the week before she passed. He had been tending them ever since, even when neighbors pelted their house with eggs or left cruel notes in their mailbox. I helped him weed in silence for a while. Then, I mentioned my research from the previous night. Peter's hands stilled. I explained what I had discovered about sudden cardiac arrest in children, how it could occur without warning, how even flawless CPR sometimes wasn't enough. Peter's entire body began to tremble. He hadn't known. No one had informed him of these possibilities. The doctors at the hospital had been too focused on the drowning aspect, and his parents had been too devastated to ask questions. The police report simply stated, accidental drowning. Case closed. I spent the next few days delving deeper. I found medical journals detailing undiagnosed heart conditions in children, statistics on survival rates even with immediate intervention, cases eerily similar to Olivia's. Each piece of information felt like a small burden lifting from my chest, and I imagined it might do the same for Peter. But when I attempted to share my findings with my parents, my mother slammed her coffee mug down so forcefully it cracked. She snatched my laptop and closed it. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling. She ordered me to stop filling my head with nonsense, declaring that the boy was dangerous, and that was final. My father supported her, his voice harsher than I had ever heard it. He claimed I was being manipulated, that Peter was playing mind games with me. They forbade me from going near him again. When I protested, my father stood up so quickly his chair toppled. He pointed at Luis, who was coloring at the table. "Do you want to lose your brother, too?" he demanded. That night, I overheard them arguing in their bedroom. My mother's voice was high and frantic. She kept repeating something about not letting it happen again. My father's responses were muffled, but I caught phrases about keeping the family safe and doing what was necessary. I slipped out my window the following night. Peter was sitting on his back porch, gazing at the stars. I showed him printed copies of the medical articles I had found. His hands shook as he read them by the porch light. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but for the first time since I had known him, they seemed different, a mix of relief and sorrow. He recounted more about that day, how Olivia had been laughing just seconds before, how she had been practicing her kicks perfectly, how there had been no struggle, no panic, just sudden stillness. It all aligned with what I had read about sudden cardiac events. We began meeting in secret after that, sometimes behind the abandoned school, sometimes in the woods at the edge of the neighborhood. Peter would bring Olivia's medical records that he had located in his parents' filing cabinet. I would bring new research. Together, we started constructing a different narrative than the one the neighborhood had settled on. But secrets don't remain hidden in small communities. Mrs. Blake saw us conversing one afternoon and immediately telephoned my mother. I returned home to find my laptop gone and my bedroom door removed from its hinges. My mother stated I had forfeited the privilege of privacy until I learned to make better choices. The punishment escalated from there. They confiscated my phone, canceled my after-school activities. My father began driving me to and from school, watching until I walked inside. They even made Luis sleep in their room, fearing I might somehow endanger him through my association with Peter. The neighborhood seemed to thrive on my parents' fear. More people began demanding Peter's removal. Someone spray-painted "Child Killer" on their garage door. Their car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Peter's mother stopped leaving the house entirely. I observed it all from my window, feeling helpless and enraged. Every time I attempted to defend Peter, to share what I had learned, I was silenced, grounded further, isolated more. My parents began discussing sending me to stay with my aunt in another state. Just for a while, just until things calmed down. One evening, I overheard my mother on the phone. She was speaking to someone about Peter's family, her voice low and urgent. She mentioned a meeting, taking decisive action, and how some stories were better left buried. The way she said it made my stomach drop. I realized then that this wasn't merely about fear or misunderstanding. Someone in our neighborhood knew more than they were letting on. Someone had reasons for keeping the narrative focused on Peter's guilt, and my mother appeared to be involved. I pressed my ear against my bedroom wall that night, straining to catch more of my mother's phone conversation. Her voice carried through the thin drywall in fragments. She mentioned hospital records and something about a favor someone owed her from years ago. My hands clenched into fists when I heard her utter Peter's name with such venom. The next morning brought new restrictions. My father installed a lock on my window from the outside. My mother stood in my doorway, watching me pack my school bag, checking every pocket and folder. She discovered the medical articles I had hidden between textbook pages and tore them into pieces without a word. At school, I learned my parents had spoken to my teachers. Mrs. Catherine pulled me aside after first period, explaining I had been moved to a different lunch schedule for my own safety. The principal's office had received concerns about my judgment. I spent lunch alone in the library, observed by the librarian, who kept glancing at me over her glasses. Peter was absent from school that day and the next. I saw his father's car leave early each morning, but their house remained dark and quiet. The purple flowers in Olivia's garden began to wilt without Peter's daily attention. On the third day, I managed to escape during gym class. I ran to Peter's house, my heart pounding. His mother answered the door, her face drawn and eyes hollow. She shook her head before I could speak, then slowly closed the door. Through the window, I saw Peter sitting at their kitchen table, staring blankly. That afternoon, my mother was waiting in the school parking lot instead of my father. She drove us a different route home, past the community center, where a meeting was apparently scheduled for that evening. She pointed to the building and told me the neighborhood was finally going to solve the Peter problem. Her satisfaction made me feel ill. I feigned doing homework while secretly tracking the time. My parents left for the meeting at 7 o'clock, dropping Luis off at a neighbor's house first. They locked me in my room, but I had been preparing. I had loosened the screws on my window lock over several nights using a butter knife I had concealed. The lock came free with effort. I climbed out and ran through backyards to avoid detection. The community center's parking lot was full. Through the windows, I could see dozens of neighbors packed inside. My mother stood at the front with a stack of papers. I crept closer, concealing myself behind the dumpster. The side door was propped open for air, and voices carried clearly. My mother was reading from what she termed evidence of Peter's dangerous behavior. She listed every instance he had been seen alone, every interaction with neighborhood children, twisting innocent actions into sinister patterns. Mrs. Blake spoke next, describing how Peter had touched her when assisting her up from the ice. She made it sound predatory instead of helpful. Other neighbors contributed their own distorted versions of events. They were constructing a case that Peter was escalating, that Luis had been targeted, that no child was safe. My stomach churned as I realized they planned to present this to Child Services to demand Peter's immediate removal. Someone mentioned they had a contact who could accelerate the process. Another neighbor, Mr. Benjamin, offered to organize a petition. They discussed taking shifts watching Peter's house to document his movements. I needed evidence of my own. I slipped away from the community center and raced to Peter's house. Their car was gone, likely at the meeting, attempting to defend their son. I recalled Peter mentioning Olivia's medical records. If I could locate proof of a heart condition, something the hospital had overlooked, it might alter everything. The back door was locked, but Peter had shown me where they kept a spare key under a fake rock. My hands trembled as I let myself in. The house smelled of sorrow and untouched meals. I found a filing cabinet in the home office and began searching. Olivia's medical folder was thin, too thin. I found routine checkup forms, vaccination records, nothing unusual. But behind the folder, I discovered something else. Hospital discharge papers from 3 years before Olivia died. She had been admitted for chest pains and an irregular heartbeat. The doctor had recommended follow-up cardiac screening that, according to the empty space in the file, never occurred. I photographed everything with an old digital camera I had found in the office. As I was leaving, headlights swept across the front window. Peter's family was home. I slipped out the back, my heart pounding, clutching the camera. Back in my room, I uploaded the photos to an old laptop I had hidden in my closet. The medical terms were complex, but the pattern was clear. Olivia had exhibited signs of a cardiac condition years before her death. The recommended tests were never performed. Perhaps they couldn't afford it, or maybe they believed she had outgrown it. Either way, Peter couldn't have known. My parents returned late, speaking in hushed, excited tones. Through my door, I heard my mother say the meeting had gone perfectly. They had enough concerned citizens to force action. The call to Child Services would be made first thing in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter's face when he spoke of Olivia. I thought about his parents, already shattered by grief, about to lose their son as well. The neighborhood had decided Peter was guilty because it was simpler than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. Before dawn, I made a decision. I printed copies of Olivia's medical records and wrote a detailed explanation of my findings. I made 30 copies using my old printer, working as quietly as possible. Then I climbed out my window one more time. I went to every house where I knew families with children resided. I slipped the evidence under doors, into mailboxes, taped to windows. Each packet included Olivia's cardiac history and articles about sudden cardiac arrest in children. I wanted them to see the truth before the morning's phone calls. The sun was rising when I finished. I was exhausted and dirty, but I felt lighter somehow. I climbed back through my window just as I heard my parents stirring. I shoved the printer under my bed and pretended to sleep. The explosion occurred at breakfast. My mother's phone rang constantly. She kept insisting she didn't know what they were talking about, hadn't seen any medical records. My father grabbed one of the packets from our own doorstep, his face darkening as he read. They confronted me immediately. My mother's face was red with fury. She demanded to know how I had obtained the records. When I remained silent, she seized my shoulders and shook me. My father had to pull her off. She shrieked that I had ruined everything, that I didn't comprehend what I had done. Through my window, I watched neighbors emerge from their houses, holding the packets, conversing in small groups. Some appeared confused, others ashamed. Mrs. Blake tore hers up without reading it, but I saw others meticulously studying the medical information. My parents locked me in my room again, but the damage was done. The phone rang all morning with neighbors calling to discuss what they had learned. I heard my mother attempting to do damage control, insisting the records could be fake, that it didn't negate Peter's negligence, but doubt had been sown. Around noon, Peter appeared in his backyard. He knelt by Olivia's garden and began pulling weeds, just as always. But this time, Mrs. Kathy from 3 houses down walked over. She stood awkwardly at the fence before handing him a watering can. They didn't speak, but Peter nodded his thanks. My mother saw it too. She stormed outside and confronted Mrs. Kathy, their voices carrying across the yards. Other neighbors watched from windows and doorways. The carefully constructed unity was fracturing. That evening, my father informed me I would be going to stay with my aunt immediately. They couldn't trust me anymore, he stated. I was a threat to the family, to Luis, to everything they had strived to build. My mother wouldn't even look at me as they packed my belongings. I managed to see Peter once more before they took me away. He was in the garden at dusk, and I called to him from my window. He looked up, and for the first time since I had known him, he almost smiled. He raised his hand in a small wave, then returned to tending Olivia's flowers. The car ride to my aunt's was silent, except for Luis crying in the back seat, not understanding why I had to leave. My mother sat rigidly in the front seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. My father kept checking the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone to follow us. At a rest stop, while my father pumped gas, my mother finally addressed me. Her voice was low and bitter. She told me, "I thought I was so smart, so righteous. But I didn't know the full story. I didn't know about the family who had lived in Peter's house before them, about their daughter who had drowned in the community pool 10 years ago, the same pool where Peter had been swimming that day with Olivia." She said the neighborhood had worked diligently to move past that tragedy, to make the community feel secure again. Peter's family moving in, bringing another drowned child, had reopened old wounds. It was simpler to assign blame to him than to concede their perfect neighborhood was plagued by coincidence. I stared at her, comprehending the depth of the self-deception. They had fabricated a mythology to avoid confronting random tragedy. Peter was simply their latest scapegoat. My mother turned away, her explanations concluded. At my aunt's house, I was given a small room and strict regulations. No phone, no computer, no contact with anyone from home. My aunt, my mother's sister, looked at me with pity and disappointment. She had been informed I was undergoing a rebellious phase, that I had endangered my family by associating with a dangerous boy. I spent 2 weeks in isolation, wondering if the seeds of truth I had planted had flourished or been crushed. My aunt monitored my every movement, reporting back to my parents daily. I heard her on the phone describing my conduct, assuring them I was showing signs of improvement. Then one morning, my aunt seemed different. She observed me over breakfast with a peculiar expression. Finally, she inquired if I wished to discuss what had truly occurred. I was wary, but desperation prevailed. I recounted everything, about Peter, Olivia, the medical records, the neighborhood's collective irrationality. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she retrieved her phone and displayed a social media post. Someone had shared Olivia's medical records online, along with a lengthy post about hasty judgment and community hysteria. The post had been shared dozens of times. Comments flooded in from people expressing shame and regret. My aunt confessed she had harbored her own doubts about the story she had been told. My mother had sounded too frantic, too insistent. She had conducted her own research after I had arrived and discovered the same medical information I had. She had been grappling with what to do. I asked if I could return home. She shook her head sadly. My parents weren't ready. The neighborhood was in turmoil. Some families were doubling down on Peter's guilt, while others were publicly apologizing. Peter's family had received several apology letters, but also fresh vandalism. The community was fragmenting. My aunt permitted me to use her computer to research more about sudden cardiac arrest in children. I compiled a comprehensive document with case studies, medical explanations, and statistics. I sent it anonymously to everyone I could find in our neighborhood's online directory. Knowledge was the only weapon I possessed from a distance. Days passed slowly. My aunt began treating me less like a captive and more like a guest. She asked questions about Peter, about what I had observed. She seemed particularly interested in his kindness, despite the cruelty he endured. She said it reminded her of something, but wouldn't elaborate. One evening, she narrated a story. When she and my mother were young, they had a neighbor who was blamed for a playground accident. The community had turned on the family, driving them away. Years later, they learned the accident had been caused by faulty equipment, not negligence. My mother had been one of the loudest voices against that family. My aunt wondered if my mother's extreme reaction to Peter was linked to that old guilt. Perhaps she couldn't face being wrong again. Or perhaps she was repeating patterns, seeking someone to blame because accepting randomness was too difficult. Regardless, my aunt was beginning to understand why I had fought so fiercely for the truth. She made a decision. She called my parents and announced she was bringing me home for a visit. My mother protested, but my aunt remained firm. She stated isolation wasn't helping anyone and that the family needed to confront this together. The call ended with my mother crying and my aunt standing resolute. The drive home felt like approaching a storm. My aunt gripped the steering wheel tightly, occasionally glancing at me with encouragement. She had printed out some of the online discussions about Olivia's case, comments from medical professionals confirming that sudden cardiac events could strike without warning. As we entered my neighborhood, I immediately noticed the changes. Peter's house no longer appeared abandoned. The vandalism had been cleaned off. Their garden was flourishing with new plants added alongside Olivia's purple flowers. Several neighbors were in their yard helping with maintenance, but other houses displayed for sale signs. The community had fractured. Those who had led the charge against Peter were either doubling down or retreating in shame. The unity built on shared suspicion had collapsed, leaving awkwardness and resentment. My house looked identical from the outside, but felt different as we pulled into the driveway. My father met us at the door, his face tired and somehow older. He hugged me stiffly, then ushered us inside where my mother awaited in the living room. Luis ran to me immediately, wrapping his arms around my waist. The conversation that ensued was painful. My mother accused me of destroying our community, our safety, our peace. I responded with facts about Olivia's medical history. My father attempted to mediate, but his heart wasn't in it. He looked defeated, caught between his wife's certainty and mounting evidence. My aunt intervened, sharing her own research and the online discussions. She pointed out that the truth would have emerged eventually, that I had simply accelerated it. She directly asked my mother if she truly believed Peter had harmed Olivia or if she simply needed someone to blame. My mother then broke down, not in acceptance, but in fury. She screamed about protecting her family, about preventing another tragedy. She brought up the previous drowning, the pattern she perceived. When my aunt pointed out that two unrelated incidents over a decade didn't constitute a pattern, my mother accused her of being manipulated as well. The argument escalated until my father intervened. He announced we would be staying with my aunt for a few more days while he and my mother worked things out. My mother protested, but he remained firm. For the first time, I saw him stand up to her hysteria. As we prepared to leave again, I saw Peter in his backyard. He was surrounded by several neighbors, including Mrs. Kathy and Mr. Benjamin. They were planting new flowers together, expanding Olivia's garden. Peter looked up and saw me watching. This time, his smile was genuine. My aunt drove us to a hotel instead of her house. She said we needed neutral ground. Over dinner, my father finally opened up. He admitted he had harbored doubts about Peter's guilt from the beginning, but had been swept up in my mother's certainty and the neighborhood's collective delusion. He had been afraid of being ostracized if he defended Peter. He showed me his phone. He had been in contact with Peter's parents, apologizing for our family's role in their persecution. They had been gracious but honest about the damage inflicted. They were considering relocating, starting fresh somewhere else. The thought tightened my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Peter tending Olivia's garden alone for months, preserving her memory while being branded her killer. I thought about his parents grieving their daughter while fighting to keep their son. I thought about my mother, so desperate to assign blame that she had convinced herself and others of a falsehood. The next morning brought unexpected news. The hospital where Olivia had been treated was conducting an internal review of her case. Someone had submitted her earlier medical records and raised questions about the missed cardiac screening. It wasn't about assigning blame, but about preventing future tragedies. My father took the call, his face grave. He looked at me with something akin to respect. My actions had not only cleared Peter's name, but might help save other children. The hospital was implementing new protocols for cardiac screening in young patients with any history of chest pains or irregular heartbeat. We returned home that afternoon to find my mother packing boxes. She informed us coldly that if we insisted on supporting that family, she would stay with her sister. My father tried to reason with her, but she was beyond reach. Louise clung to her, crying, not understanding why everyone was quarreling. I made one last attempt. I asked her to accompany me to Peter's house, to see Olivia's garden, to speak to his parents. She refused, but something in my voice must have resonated with her because she paused at the door. She said she knew I believed I was right, but some truths were too perilous to expose. Then she left. The neighborhood felt different without her presence. Quieter, but also more authentic. My father struggled to maintain normalcy for Luis while processing his own guilt. He had chosen the crowd over his conscience, and now his family was fractured. I finally had a proper conversation with Peter. We sat in Olivia's garden, now expanded into a memorial space. He thanked me for uncovering the truth, but his voice was hollow. The damage was done. His parents were selling the house. They couldn't remain where their daughter had died, and their son had been tormented for it. He showed me a letter from the hospital. They had reviewed Olivia's case and confirmed my suspicions. She had an undiagnosed cardiac condition that could have been detected with proper screening. Her death was a preventable tragedy, but not due to Peter's actions. It was due to systemic medical oversight. The letter should have brought relief, but Peter just looked weary. He said the truth didn't erase the months of animosity, the vandalism, the threats. His parents couldn't bear to look at neighbors who had smiled while labeling their son a killer. They needed a fresh start. I understood, but it felt like another injustice. Peter's family was still being punished, just differently. They were losing their home, their community, because the neighborhood needed a villain more than it needed truth. The truly culpable parties faced no repercussions beyond private shame. Over the following days, several neighbors approached me. Some expressed gratitude for revealing the truth. Others blamed me for dividing the community. Mrs. Blake refused to accept the medical evidence, clinging to her narrative. But Mr. Benjamin apologized profusely, admitting he had been swept up in fear and groupthink. The divisions in the neighborhood deepened. Those who had led the charge against Peter either doubled down or retreated entirely. Those who had remained silent wrestled with their complicity, and those who had defended him felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow for not doing more sooner. My father endeavored to hold our family together. He took time off work to care for Luis and me. He attended therapy to comprehend how he had been so easily swayed by collective hysteria. He wrote a lengthy letter to Peter's family, accepting responsibility for his actions. They responded graciously, but maintained their decision to relocate. I spent my last days before Peter left, helping expand Olivia's garden. Other neighbors joined us, attempting to make amends through action. We planted purple flowers and installed a small bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of Olivia, who loved to swim and laugh and grow beautiful things." Peter worked alongside us, quiet, but no longer alone. The garden became a space for the community to confront its failings. Some couldn't bear the reminder and avoided that corner of the neighborhood. Others visited daily, leaving small tokens or tending the plants. My mother called occasionally, speaking only to my father. She remained convinced she had been protecting us from danger. She couldn't accept that she had been the danger, that her fear had created the very monster she imagined. My father ceased trying to convince her, focusing instead on mending the damage within our reach. The day Peter's family moved, half the neighborhood came to assist and bid farewell. The other half remained hidden in their homes. I helped Peter carefully transplant some of Olivia's flowers to take with them. He promised to keep tending them, to keep her memory alive in a place not tainted by false accusations. His mother embraced me before they departed. She whispered that I had displayed more courage than all the adults combined. But she also said courage had arrived too late to shield them from the pain. They needed to go somewhere Peter could simply be a grieving brother, not a neighborhood monster. As their car pulled away, I felt the weight of what had transpired. The truth had triumphed, but at immense cost. Families were fractured, trust shattered, a community divided, all because fear and rumor were simpler than compassion and inquiry. My father placed his hand on my shoulder as we watched them go. He said I had done the right thing, even if the outcomes were messy. Truth usually was, but living with falsehoods was worse, even if it felt safer. He promised we would work to rebuild, to learn from this tragedy. That evening, I sat alone in Olivia's expanded garden. The purple flowers swayed in the breeze, beautiful and indifferent to the human drama surrounding them. I thought about Peter, starting anew somewhere distant, carrying the burden of unjust accusation alongside his grief. The neighborhood would eventually heal, find new routines, new gossip. Some would learn from this, becoming slower to judge and quicker to verify. Others would find new targets for their fear and suspicion. But Olivia's garden would endure, a reminder that truth matters, even when it arrives late. Luis found me there as darkness fell. He crawled into my lap, still bewildered by all the changes. I held him close, vowing to teach him to question, to investigate, to choose truth over convenient lies. It was the least I could do to honor Olivia's memory and Peter's undeserved suffering. I walked back inside to find my father sitting at the kitchen table with Luis, helping him with a puzzle. The pieces scattered across the surface reminded me of our fragmented neighborhood. My father looked up and gestured for me to join them. His eyes held exhaustion, but also determination. Over the next few days, I witnessed my father's transformation. He began attending neighborhood gatherings again, facing the uncomfortable silences and pointed glances. He approached families individually, acknowledging his role in the persecution. Some accepted his apologies gracefully, others turned away, unable to forgive. Mrs. Blake remained the most resistant. She organized a small group of holdouts who insisted Peter's family leaving proved their guilt. They met at her house weekly, reinforcing each other's delusions. I saw them through her window one evening, heads bent together over coffee, still plotting. My father discovered Mrs. Blake had been spreading new rumors. She claimed I had broken into Peter's house to plant the medical records, that the whole thing was an elaborate deception. She even suggested my family had been compensated by Peter's parents to alter our story. The situation escalated when Mrs. Blake confronted me outside the grocery store. She blocked my path with her shopping cart, her face contorted with anger. She accused me of destroying their safe community, of endangering children. Other shoppers paused to observe the scene unfold. I stepped around her cart without engaging, but she followed me through the store. She narrated my every move to other customers, warning them about the dangerous teenager who defended child killers. The store manager eventually intervened, requesting Mrs. Blake to leave me alone. That night, my father received multiple calls from neighbors. Some had witnessed Mrs. Blake's behavior and were concerned. Others supported her, believing I needed to be held accountable for my actions. The community's divisions were solidifying into permanent fractures. My father made a decision. He organized a neighborhood meeting at our house, inviting everyone regardless of their stance. He spent days preparing, gathering all the medical documentation, research papers, and expert opinions I had collected. He desired one final attempt at reconciliation. The evening of the meeting, only 12 people showed up. Mrs. Blake and her supporters boycotted. Those who came seemed weary, worn down by months of conflict. They sat in our living room with careful distances between them, like magnets with opposing poles. My father presented the evidence methodically. He displayed Olivia's medical history, the missed cardiac screening, the statistics on sudden cardiac arrest in children. He read statements from medical professionals who had reviewed the case. He kept his voice steady, factual, devoid of emotion. Mr. Benjamin spoke up first. He admitted he had been mistaken, that fear had obscured his judgment. He described how his own daughter had recently been diagnosed with a heart murmur, making him realize how easily tragedy could befall any family. His voice cracked as he apologized for his role in tormenting Peter. Mrs. Kathy shared her own revelation. She had researched the previous drowning my mother had mentioned, the one from 10 years ago. She had found newspaper archives showing it was caused by a pool drain malfunction, not negligence. The family had won a settlement from the manufacturer. There was no pattern, just tragic coincidence. One by one, others began sharing their regrets and realizations. They spoke about groupthink, about how simple it had been to believe the worst. They acknowledged the cruelty they had participated in or enabled through silence. The room grew heavy with collective shame. But not everyone was ready for reconciliation. Mrs. Vicky, who had initially seemed sympathetic, suddenly stood up. She announced she couldn't listen anymore, that we were rewriting history to make ourselves feel better. She left abruptly, taking 2 others with her. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months began tentatively reconnecting. Plans emerged for repairing the community, including a memorial fund in Olivia's name for cardiac screening for local children. It felt like a small step toward healing. Over the following weeks, the memorial fund gained momentum. My father dedicated himself to organizing it, perhaps seeking redemption through action. Local businesses donated, and even some who had boycotted the meeting contributed anonymously. The fund quickly raised enough for several screenings. The first screening day arrived on a Saturday morning. Families lined up at the community center, children clutching parents' hands. I volunteered to assist with registration, watching nervous parents complete forms. 3 children were identified with previously undetected heart conditions. 3 potential tragedies prevented. One mother broke down crying when she received her daughter's results. She hugged me tightly, whispering thanks through her tears. Her daughter needed immediate treatment for a condition that could have claimed her during sports or even while sleeping. Peter's suffering had led to her child's salvation. Mrs. Blake watched from across the street, arms crossed. She had forbidden her grandchildren from participating, calling it a publicity stunt. but I noticed her expression wavering as she observed families leaving with relief or urgent medical referrals. Seeds of doubt were finally penetrating her certainty. The hospital that had treated Olivia reached out to my father. They wished to feature our community's memorial fund in their new cardiac screening awareness campaign. They offered to provide free screenings quarterly and train local teachers in recognizing warning signs. My father accepted immediately. I returned to school to find the dynamics completely transformed. Some classmates treated me like a hero, others like an outcast. Teachers observed me carefully, unsure how to handle the student who had disrupted an entire neighborhood. I focused on my studies, avoiding both praise and confrontation. My mother called less frequently. When she did, she spoke only to Luis, filling his head with promises of visits that never materialized. My father stopped putting her on speaker, shielding Luis from the manipulation. Their divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a neutral party. Luis struggled with the changes. He had nightmares about drowning, about ice cracking beneath his feet. He would wake up calling for Peter, the boy who had saved him, but whom he had been taught to fear. My father found him a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. I began visiting other families who had lost children to sudden cardiac events. I collected their stories, creating a presentation for schools about the importance of screening. Each family shared their pain, but also their gratitude that awareness was spreading. Their children's deaths might save others. One family showed me their daughter's room, preserved exactly as she had left it. On her desk was a science project about the heart she had been working on before she died. Her mother said she had been complaining of chest pains, but they had assumed it was anxiety about starting middle school. The parallels to Olivia were haunting. The presentation grew into something larger. The hospital invited me to speak at a medical conference about community awareness and the dangers of hasty judgment. I declined media interviews, but agreed to share our story with medical professionals who could use it to save lives. At the conference, I met other families who had faced similar situations, communities that had blamed parents for accidents that were actually medical events. Children ostracized for tragedies beyond anyone's control. The pattern of seeking someone to blame rather than accepting randomness was disturbingly common. A pediatric cardiologist pulled me aside afterward. She explained how many childhood cardiac conditions went undiagnosed because symptoms were subtle or dismissed. She thanked me for my courage in pursuing the truth, stating my actions would ripple outward in ways I couldn't imagine. Back home, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The for sale signs gradually vanished as new families moved in, unaware of the recent turmoil. The old guard who had led the persecution either adapted or retreated into isolation. Mrs. Blake ceased attending community events entirely. My father and I worked to maintain Olivia's garden. We added a small plaque explaining the memorial fund and listing the number of children screened. Visitors often left flowers or small donations. The garden became a place of reflection rather than accusation. On the anniversary of Olivia's death, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a photo of Peter kneeling in a new garden, purple flowers blooming around him. His mother's note explained they had found peace in their new town. Peter was volunteering with a youth swim program, teaching water safety. He had found a way to honor Olivia through service. The photo showed Peter smiling genuinely, no longer the haunted boy I had known. Behind him stood other teenagers, kids who saw him as a mentor rather than a monster. His parents had included a pressed purple flower from Olivia's new garden, a tangible connection between past and present. I kept the flower in my journal alongside all the medical research and documentation. Sometimes I would flip through the pages, remembering the journey from suspicion to truth. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative would have been worse. Living with falsehoods corrodes communities from within. My father eventually began dating a woman from the next town over. She knew our story, but judged us by our actions rather than our past. Luis warmed to her slowly, finding in her the stability he had lost. Our family was reshaping itself, different but not broken. The memorial fund reached a milestone of 100 children screened. 5 had been identified with serious cardiac conditions requiring immediate intervention. 5 families spared the grief Peters had endured. The numbers felt both triumphant and heartbreaking, representing lives saved and lost. I graduated high school with plans to study public health. My experience had shown me how community health extended beyond physical ailments to social diseases like mob mentality and hasty judgment. I wanted to address both, to prevent tragedies and the secondary trauma of false blame. My mother never returned. She remarried someone who didn't know our history, creating a new life built on careful omissions. Luis spoke to her monthly, but the calls grew shorter and less frequent. He was constructing his own understanding of truth and family, guided by hard-won wisdom. On my last day before college, I visited Olivia's garden one final time. The purple flowers bloomed magnificently, tended by rotating volunteers who had embraced the memorial's mission. Children played nearby, their laughter mingling with bird song. The space that had once symbolized accusation now radiated hope. I thought about Peter, somewhere distant, teaching kids to swim. About Olivia, whose death had ultimately saved others. About my mother, trapped in her inability to admit error. About my father, who had found redemption through action. About Luis, growing up with difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. The garden would continue without me, as would the screening program and the slow work of community healing. My role in this story was concluding, but the ripples would continue spreading. Truth, once released, couldn't be contained. It would find its way into hearts ready to receive it, changing lives in ways both subtle and profound. As I walked away, I noticed Mrs. Blake watching from her window. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the armor of certainty she had worn for so long. I nodded slightly, then continued walking. Some journeys toward truth take longer than others, but the destination remains the same. The neighborhood looked different now. Neither the perfect community my mother had tried to preserve, nor the battlefield it had become. It was simply a place where people lived, flawed and struggling, capable of both cruelty and redemption. The truth hadn't healed everything, but it had made healing possible. I drove past Peter's old house, now home to a young family unaware of its history. Children played in the yard where Peter had once stood alone. The past lingered in the soil and memories, but life had moved forward. The cycle of blame had broken, replaced by something more honest, if less comfortable. My father waited at home with Luis, ready to drive me to college. Our family had survived, transformed, but intact. We had learned that truth could shatter illusions and relationships, but what remained afterward was stronger because it was real. The easy falsehoods had nearly destroyed us. The difficult truths had set us free.